Okay, it's telling me I'm live, so this is good. We'll wait one more minute, and then I will begin. Welcome, everybody. My name is Doug Noll. I am, as you can see on the screen, a visionary, a peacemaker, and an author. And I study human conflict and human emotions, emotional competency, and emotional intelligence, because I found over 40 plus years of professional practice that we are emotional beings, not rational beings. And the moment we start understanding our own emotional essence, we can actually correct a lot of the problems that we see when we think of ourselves as rational. So one of the areas of interest to me is empathy. And I've been looking at a lot of articles around empathy and leadership. And it turns out that a study came out earlier this fall from a group called Catalyst that talked about the importance of empathy in leadership. And I have always been interested in this topic. So I thought today I would talk a little bit about the myths of empathy and leadership, because as is true with just about everything around emotions and our emotional selves, there is just so much misinformation and so many conventional wisdoms that are wrong and myths that are wrong. And I want to correct that as much as I possibly can. So the first thing that I think is really interesting is the interest that this has developed in the business press. So here is a headline from Forbes online. I did this yesterday. I did a simple Google search for empathy and leadership, and I came up with a number of articles published online in most of the major business sites, and they're all talking about empathy and leadership and how important it is. And I'll come back and talk about these in a moment and how poor these articles are. But here's one from Fortune. Empathy is the go-to leadership skill of the moment. This was not even almost just a little bit less than a week ago. Or why empathic leadership is more important than ever. This one was 3 weeks ago. This is the most important skill for a leader to have right now. World Economic Forum, it's about empathy. The problem is, oh, look at this. We can't even see all that. The problem that we have is that no one knows what empathy is. You can read all of these business articles, or you can go online and search for concepts of empathy, and nobody really talks about empathy and emotions. And so there's just a lot of non-information and misinformation. So it's no wonder that when leaders and entrepreneurs and business people read these articles that say empathy is the most important skill, and then they want to learn more about empathy and what it is and how they can develop it, they end up with an absolute blank because nobody really understands this stuff very well. The reason that I've developed some knowledge and skill in this area is because in my work as a peacemaker and mediator, empathy is a foundational skill. When I walk into a highly intense conflict where people are extremely emotional, I have to be able to manage the emotions in the room. And so for me, it's essential that I understand empathy and be able to exercise empathy appropriately. So that's why I've devoted so much time to learning and understanding what empathy is and isn't. So another thing that's really interesting is you will read in some of these articles, you'll read that empathy can't be learned, that it's a trait. That's absolutely false. empathy is a learned skill like riding a bike. And you just have to learn the skill and master it, and then you can do it. But that leads to another problem, because people that claim to teach emotional intelligence don't know what empathy is. They don't even know what emotions are. They don't have a foggiest clue about how to go about helping you learn to develop the skill of empathy. And this is pervasive throughout the internet and throughout all kinds of trainings around emotional competency, emotional intelligence, and leadership. It's one of those things that everybody talks about, but when you start diving into the weeds and start asking, well, how do you do it? And what is it? And what do you mean by this? And how do I learn this? All you do is get glassy-eyed stares of deer in the headlights, because most trainers and leadership development people have not a clue what this is really all about. They know it sounds good, so they promote it because they can make money. But when it comes to actually adding value, there's nothing there. So what I'd like to do is take a few minutes and go through some of the common misunderstandings of empathy, so that we're all on the same page and we can know what empathy isn't. And then, of course, I will tell you what empathy is and give you a very precise definition. And then at the end, I'll give you the 3-step process for developing empathy and a link to a brand new, very simple online course I have. It's very inexpensive as an entry-level beginner course to start teaching you this skill if it's something you're interested in. So one of the most common definitions of empathy is something like putting yourself in someone else's shoe to understand how they think. Walk a mile in the other person's moccasins, I think, is an old saying. And the idea here is that if you can somehow insert yourself into somebody else's mind and understand what they are thinking, that somehow makes you have empathy. Well, this is a myth, and this is not true, and this is not what empathy is, for a number of different reasons. First of all, this is, if anything, this is just, it's not even really descriptive of what empathy is. It's not prescriptive. It doesn't tell you what to do. And it's not even normative. It doesn't even tell you this is the right way to do empathy. It's just a statement of putting yourself into somebody else's shoes. Well, how do you do that? Do you literally step into their shoes? Or do you have to use your imagination, imagine what it would feel like to be with this person? So you've got to use cognitive processing. I don't know about you, but many, many years ago, when I was beginning to study this stuff, this is what I thought we had to do. We had to somehow use our cognitive process and imagine what it would be like to feel or to think about what another person's thinking. And then what do you do with it? You know, okay, so I can imagine what it's like to be what you're doing. How do I respond to that? So this is a really common and misleading and mythical definition of what empathy is, and you'll hear this a lot. Whenever you hear somebody say something like this is what empathy is, you can pretty much be guaranteed that they don't know what empathy is and they don't understand emotions. So in my personal opinion, people that define empathy this way lack complete credibility. Here's another definition. I'm pulling these actually out of the articles that I showed, those headlines I showed. I just said, well, what are they talking about empathy? And only 3 of the 6 actually had any kind of attempt to define empathy. This one says, to be a genuinely empathic leader, empathetic leader, you need to be first able to show a level of understanding. Well, at a broad level, that's true. This requires actively listening to what someone else is dealing with. Well, what do we mean by actively listening? And what are we listening to? And that's the problem here, is that this is a very imprecise definition, and it's using a term that is now discredited, active listening. Active listening was developed by Thomas Gordon, a psychologist in the 1960s. His work has been completely discredited as being ineffectual. And yet the term active listening still persists, and human resource people and even mediation trainers and people in therapy work still refer to active listening and train in this active listening, which doesn't work. So it's really deeply embedded in our culture, even though it's ungrounded in any kind of science or empirical study. And then and asking the right questions to gain deeper understanding. So according to this definition, you have to actively listen, whatever that is, and then you have to ask questions to gain deeper understanding. So this must mean that you're paying attention to the words. And in fact, this is a myth because you never listen to the words to understand and develop empathy. In fact, you have to ignore the words to develop true empathy, as I will explain in just a moment. So this definition is slightly more precise, but it is inaccurate and portrays inaccurate information. It's basically saying that if you actively listen and ask questions, then you will gain understanding and that will make you empathetic. But notice how it's all focused on you. It's not focused on the speaker. It's not focused on the person you're trying to be empathetic to. And here's another common error and myth in developing empathy, and that is that the focus of all these definitions is always on me, the person who is supposed to be empathetic, not on the person who is emotional and needs an empathetic person acting in a certain way to be present. Another great myth of empathy. And it's one of the reasons why so many leaders and entrepreneurs eschew the idea of empathy, because it just doesn't work the way that people say it does. Here's a third one. I'm going to get rid of, I wonder if I can get rid of that. I'm going to change this just a little bit so you can see it. Being in his or her position would make me feel, and here we see this lovely elderly couple, both with sore backs. So again, this kind of empathy seems to require us to imagine what it would be like to be in their position and then what feelings they have. Of course, we don't even define what feeling is. Is feeling an emotion? Is it a physical feeling? Is it somatic? I mean, when we talk about make me feel, what exactly are we talking about? And then, like all the other definitions, once we can feel what they feel, or maybe we can guess at it somehow, then what do we do with it? What is the action that we have to take in order to demonstrate true empathy and to really make empathy an effective leadership tool? And again, you can see that none of these definitions give us any help whatsoever in trying to understand that problem. Whoops, let's go the other way. All right, so here's another big problem with empathy. Most people believe that empathy is a caring point of view, that when we show empathy, we're showing that we really care about something. But really, that's not it at all. Really, empathy is an information point of view. And this is where I divert away from everybody else, because the truth of the matter is, as I've learned in neuroscience, is that what is missed is that empathy is the ability to absorb, process, and respond to emotional information from the speaker's frame of reference. Here is your precise definition of empathy. It tells you exactly what you have to do. It's normative, it's descriptive, and it's also prescriptive. So first of all, you have to be able to absorb emotional information from the speaker, from the person who's upset. Second, you have to be able to process that information. And third, you have to respond to that emotional information from the speaker's frame of reference. If you respond to it from your frame of reference, it is not empathy. It's something else. I don't know what it is, but it's not empathy. Empathy only works when you can validate the speaker's emotions from the speaker's frame of reference. So the first step is understanding how to absorb this information. And the first thing to understand is that emotions are data, just like numbers on a spreadsheet. And that data comes in basically three forms. Facial expression, which are eyes and mouth, that constitutes about 55% of the emotional data that people project out from themselves. Tonality, volume, and speed and pacing of their voice constitutes about 38% of the emotional information or the emotional data that people are projecting. And interestingly, content, the words themselves, only constitute about 7% of the emotional information that is being conveyed, the emotional data. So you can see that if I focus on words to try to understand somebody else's emotional experience, try to absorb and respond and process and respond to it, I'm going to miss 93% of the information that's being conveyed. Now, there's a lot more to learn here about how all of this works. It involves numerous neural circuits in the brain connected to the polyvagal system, which connects to all the viscera and connects to the eye muscles and muscles around the mouth and pharyngeal muscles and nerves that control voice and also controls what we hear. So the polyvagal system is the network that connects what's going on in our brains emotionally with the rest of our body. And so understanding the interplay between the neural circuits of the lateral prefrontal cortex, the medial prefrontal cortex, and all the different parts of the brain that have some involvement in emotion becomes really important to understand why this is all science-based and not just some old pop psychology from the 1960s. I don't have time to go into that right now, and you probably don't want to listen to it anyways, but I'll give you an opportunity later if you'd like to go a little deeper into this. It's really quite fascinating. And it demonstrates that we are not who we think our human nature is quite different than what we've been told. So just to lay this out in a little bit more deeply, here is the regions of the brain that are used for facial identification, which is an innate skill that every human being has. We can identify faces and identify facial expressions almost instantaneously. Same thing with emotions and motives. There are regions of the brain that are specifically designed to read emotional data fields being projected by other people, absorb it and process it almost instantaneously and effortlessly. This is a skill. This ability to read emotional data fields is a skill that has existed in hominids for millions of years. Today, it's a skill that we don't use. We have it. It's innate, but we don't have it. We don't use it because we privilege rationality over emotions, and so we never actually think about how do I go about reading the emotional data fields of another person. And actually, it's quite easy, and it's surprisingly accurate when we put ourselves in the right mindset for reading somebody else's emotions. We can absorb and process those emotions very, very quickly, effortlessly, and almost always be correct. Rarely are we wrong when we process somebody else's emotions. So that gets us to the idea of empathy, which is, what do we do once we've absorbed and processed these emotions of another person? And where the empathy comes in is what we call cognitive empathy and affective empathy. The way this works is you learn cognitive empathy, which I'm going to show you how to do that in just a second. It's a 3-step process. And as you practice cognitive empathy, then what happens is your brain develops the skill of affective empathy. And what happens in affective empathy is you're just able to see an emotional person, or maybe the emotion's overt, maybe they're not, but you can look at a person and you can read their emotional data fields, even though they're trying to hide them from you. And you immediately know what they're feeling. You don't even have to think about it. And because you might even feel it inside yourself. That's affective empathy. Very fast, very powerful. That develops over time when you practice cognitive empathy. And the way that you practice cognitive empathy is a 3-step process. The first step is whenever you are in the presence of somebody who's upset or somebody who's happy, somebody who's having an emotional experience, or maybe the opposite, they're completely shut down. They're having emotions, but they're not displaying emotions. What you need to do is ignore the words. Remember, it's only 7% of the information. If you ignore the words, that frees up bandwidth in your brain to pay attention to all the nonverbal information that's going to tell you all the different emotions that people are experiencing. The next thing you're going to do is read the emotional data fields. As I said before, we have the innate ability to read each other's emotions accurately, efficiently, and quickly without effort. Now, the thing to understand is that whenever somebody is emotional and they're showing some emotion, they come in layers. Emotions never just come one emotion at a time. So, for example, if you see somebody who's really angry, there are probably going to be 5 or 6 emotions underneath that anger that need to be identified and responded to, as well as the anger itself. And so, for example, somebody could be really angry, they could be frustrated, They could be anxious. They could feel disrespected, unappreciated, unsupported. They could feel betrayed. They could feel shame or humiliation or embarrassment. They could actually feel sadness. They could feel loss of connection, abandonment, and at the very bottom, they could feel unloved and unconnected. All of those emotions are underneath the presenting emotion of anger. And what we need to do when we are exercising cognitive or affective empathy is identify and reflect as many of those emotions as we can possibly see. And the good news is that as human beings, we have a small repertoire of emotional behaviors. And so with practice, and not a lot of practice, you can quickly identify what people are experiencing and identify the core emotions that are underlying their behavior. Now, for a leader, this becomes, I'll talk about why this is critical for a leader in just a moment. Let's get through the steps. So step 2 is read the emotional data fields. And I'll give you a quick tip. All you really have to do is just sit in silence, empty your mind, just be quiet for a moment, let your mind be silent, and observe the other person. And within a second or two, the emotions that they're experiencing will start to percolate into your consciousness. And you simply absorb and process that information. Now, I said before that empathy is much more than just caring about somebody. It's much more than just feeling what they're feeling or walking in their shoes, because you have to do something to demonstrate an understanding or validation of the other person's experience. And you do that by reflecting the emotions with a simple use statement. So if I were with you and you were angry, I might say something like, you're really angry. You feel really disrespected. You're frustrated and you're worried. Nobody's listening to you. You feel completely unappreciated and you feel like you've been treated really unfairly. And you feel like you've been betrayed and unsupported. And that's really pissing you off. And as a result of that, what happens in the brain is an immediate calming effect. There are brain scanning studies that demonstrate how this works. And the other person will start to calm down. And as you continue to label their emotions verbally and reflect back what you see they are experiencing, literally their prefrontal cortex, particularly the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, comes back online because it's been shut down by the emotion. And the emotional centers of the brain are inhibited. And now they regain impulse control and executive function. And they are able to process information again. And this is the most powerful way to deal with other people's emotions. Now, what is the implications of this for leadership? If you think about what are the things that you would want your people to experience in a team, they would be words like loyalty, productivity, working hard, being happy, being satisfied, finding meaning, being motivated, being creative, contributing, collaborating, coordinating with each other, helping each other. Those are all emotional states. And as a leader, it's your job to support those emotional states and to allow those emotional states to grow. So the functions of leadership are very simple. A leader is somebody in a group that provides focus, direction, and safety for the group to perform tasks that create outcomes. And that's all a leader does. A leader doesn't do the tasks work him or herself. The leader is there to provide that focus, direction, and safety. And the safety is created through empathy. And empathy is created by reading the emotional data, ignoring the words, and reading the emotional data fields of each individual team member as appropriate, reflecting back as appropriate the emotional experience that team member is having until the team member says, yes, that's exactly how I feel. Now, the other thing you can do at a higher level is label the emotions of a group. And that's a much more advanced skill, but it works the same way. The group will carry emotions with it, which are layered. And as the leader, you're going to read into the group energy, the group emotional energy, and sense what the common emotions are, and you'll label the whole group emotions. You guys are feeling really frustrated, you're really angry, you're upset, whatever it might be. And you'll start to see heads nod. And what the research shows is that when you create this kind of empathy, where you are demonstrating, because you're reflecting back the emotional experience that people are having on your team, when you demonstrate that you truly understand them at a deep emotional level, you're being empathetic. And what happens from that is, first of all, people are deeply grateful that you have listened them into existence. They become loyal. You become seen as a trusted leader. You become a leader that everyone wants to follow, simply because you've taken the time to validate these people and listen deeply to their emotional experience. So when we talk about empathy, we're talking about a very precise set of skills that can be mastered with a little bit of effort. It doesn't take a long time to master this stuff if you practice it, and completely changes the dynamics of every team you will ever lead. Not only that, it'll change the dynamics of everything in your life, both your personal life and your professional life. So that is the short story about the myths of empathy in leadership. For this live event, I've created an entry-level course on how to develop these skills. And it, of course, is less than $200, and it won't take long to do it. 13 lessons, all of which are less than 20 minutes. If you're interested in really developing empathy as a leader, then you might want to look at this. The page to get there on my website is dougnoll.com, develop emotional competency. And like I said, it's an entry-level course, beginner's course, and it'll get you started, and you'll find out whether or not this is something that you think is worthwhile and can develop. So check out the course if you'd like to learn more. And you can always email me at my at my address. Oh, that's not there. So let's change this around so we can see it. It is, oh, you can't read it there either. All right, well, it says my email address is doug@dougnoll.com. doug@dougnoll.com. I answer all my own emails. You can also message me on whatever platform you're on. I've got most of the major platforms, and I watch my messages come in, and I will be happy to get back to you and answer questions. And that's it. I hope this has been an enlightening half hour on empathy and leadership. And next Thursday is Thanksgiving, so I'll be dark, but I will be returning in the first week of December with another live stream on some topic around emotions, emotional competency, de-escalation, those sorts of things. And I'm always open to ideas about things you'd like to learn about. So feel free to, again, email me at doug@dougnoll.com if there's something you'd like me to take up. And with that, we'll call it